Redux. So Redux is a library. It's a JavaScript library. It's not specific to React, right? So it can be used with many other libraries such as Angular or jQuery, or it's used for maintaining state, right? For generating the next state based on event handling, right? It's more or less it's an encapsulation of the concern of how is it that an application maintains state and evolves that state over time as the user interacts with that application. So as the user generates a stream of events by clicking, dragging, typing, right? How does the state evolve over time as the application reacts to these events, right? And it takes the approach of encapsulating all this logic of calculating what the next state is and into a function, right? It's a pure JavaScript function so it's not React specific. It's no specific to any particular language. It's just a pure function that takes as arguments the previous state of the application, or maybe an initial state, and then also the events that come into the function. And then the function's responsibility is to say, well, given where we are now, and given the events that come in, what should be the next state, right? And you encapsulate all that logic into a single function. Or you can spread it up if your application is fairly complex. You can spread it off over a couple of functions as well. Okay. So that's the crux of the concept of Redux, right? Let's encapsulate a single place that is responsible for calculating the state of the application. Basically, encapsulating the implementation of some kind of a finite state machine, yes, that looks at the different state that an application could be in, right, and looks at the transitions between these states and all the events that cause it to go from one state to the next. Make sense? Right? Basically, it's implement a finite state machine, and then everything else is just plumbing. How do you connect this function that calculates state? How do you plug it into the React framework, or you plug it into the Angular framework, or you plug it into a jQuery framework? Okay, how do you plug it in? And that's the hard part. The hard part is the plumbing, right? Everybody gets caught up on the plumbing, right? Of how is it that, right, the event is going through and the state is then fed into React, and then how is that then rendered by a component? So that everybody gets caught up on just the plumbing. Okay, the concept is very, very easy, right? But plumbing is really hard. So let's take a look at just in a diagram some of the concepts that we're gonna be using. Basically, you have somewhere we're gonna keep track of some state. The state is going to be represented by JSON objects, right? That are going to have all sorts of properties in there, right? And name value pairs. Okay, so this is going to be just a plain old JSON object that somehow, right? Somebody's going to compute this state, right? This JSON object, and we're going to call them the reducers. The reducer, right? It's jargon speak in Redux, is the function, right? Is the pure JavaScript function that takes in as argument a stream of events, right? An initial state, and then it reduces all these events and these state into the next state. Make sense? The other key feature or key concept here is that the state is not mutated. Right? Up to this point, what the examples that we've been looking at using plain old React and maintaining this.state, and we've been doing this.setState. Yes, we've been looking at mutating the state, meaning the application was at a particular state, and then it mutated the state into a next state. Yes, Redux goes away from that model and instead says that we do not ever mutate the state. Instead, we calculate the next state. Right? I always tell you what the next state is. Right? We never modify the previous state. And then it is the application's responsibility to re-render, right? Re-render the application based on what the next state is. Make sense? Right? So the reducer's responsibility is to take all the actions and events that the user generates, compute what the next state of the application is, and store it in what is called a store. Right? A store is it's a collection, or it's a an object that can be keep track of all the states that the application has ever been in, right? So for instance, it would allow us to, for instance, implement very easily undo. Undo basically is what? Is go back to the previous state. Yes. So if you have all those states calculated, right, as a stream of objects that have been generated over time, right, you could very easily just just go in reverse order or in forwards order and jump around the different state of the application that's ever been, right, and re-render the application in any one of those states that the application has ever been. Then the plumbing starts. Then the plumbing starts. This is where Redux ends, and now the plumbing starts on how do you hook up this concept of maintaining the state and mutating and evolving the state over time, and how do you plug it into the React framework that we've been using so far? Yes, right. So that there's the plumbing starts with the concept of a provider. The provider's responsibility is to be the interface between the Redux world and the React world. Okay, and it encapsulates that mapping between these two worlds by a custom element, right? HTML element called the provider, right? Just like we have all sorts of components that we build, right? The Redux library creates a provider element that maps the store and feeds it into our components, all right, into our React components. Make sense? All right. All right. The next part of the plumbing is that we're going to differentiate between two types of React components, which we've been doing so far a little bit. We've been doing a little bit in up to this point in here in class and in the assignments. We've been somewhat differentiating between components whose responsibility is only for rendering purposes, yes, that receive the data from the outside world in the form of a property, right? Its only responsibility is to render that content, right? An example of them is, for instance, the course row, right? Or maybe the module list, right? That just receives an array of modules and it just renders the modules. Or the tabs. You just give me the array of lessons and I render them as tabs. Yes? So these components, we've typically been building them with as simple functions, right? Just using ES6 functions, right? That just return the HTML. Yes? Right. So they receive the data, the entire data as properties. Internally, they don't maintain any state whatsoever. Yes? Okay, they don't maintain any state whatsoever. They receive data from the outside world, and they themselves don't maintain any state. They just get the data and they just render it. So those, we're going to just refer to them as just plain old components. Yes? Just plain old components. Now, we have had components in React that have maintained state, either maintain this.state or have some event handler that modifies the state using this.setState. Yes? That have event handlers that delete content, that remove, that update content, that create content, create course, delete course. Yes? Right? Are handling events. Make sense? Right? And they do manipulate the state. Make sense? Right? Those we're going to refer as containers. We refer to them as containers. Containers, now containers are going to be the ones responsible for mapping the state of the generated by Redux, mapping it to the components. But because notice, we're going to abandon, right? We're going to abandon the fact that we're going to handle, this.state, or we're not going to have anymore this.setState, right? Because we're going to delegate that responsibility of maintaining state. It's no longer going to be the responsibility of React. Instead, we're going to delegate all the responsibility of maintaining the state to Redux. Say, hey, Redux, you handle the state. React will no longer handle the state. So you'll never see any more, this.state or this.setState. Yes? It's not going to be handling any of that. Instead, our containers are going to be fairly dumb. The only responsibility that they're going to have is mapping the state that is being provided by the Redux world, and it's going to map it into the properties that the components are expecting. Right? So that's the only responsibility. They're going to map between this new world, say, hey, it's not my responsibility anymore to maintain the state. Redux is doing all that. Right? My responsibility now is delegated to just say, I'm just going to map the state that Redux is generating, and I'm going to map it to the provider. Right? And the provider will just render it. Make sense? All right. Now, typically these components, even though these components, most of them will be stateless, most of them will be implemented as just plain old pure functions, like we've seen, we've implemented a couple of those. It doesn't hurt that some of these components might want to maintain some state internally, okay? Some state that perhaps doesn't spill to other components, right? Some internal state, right? So maybe I want to maintain the fact that I'm highlighted or I'm not highlighted, or maybe I'm rendering as an input field as opposed to a label, right? But all this state, the state might be, encapsulated only inside of the component. It doesn't spill across anyone else. So that's okay. It's okay that these components could maintain their own state, right? But any state that is global or goes across multiple components, right? Those kind of state should be delegated to the reducers, right? Generating the states for the entire application. Make sense? Okay. All right. There's also some additional details on if these components generate any events, because you're clicking on a button or delete icon and whatnot. So they're also generating events. Those events need to be also mapped and sent over to the reducer, so that the reducer can then take together what the current state of the application is, plus the events that were generated by the components, and then calculate the new state that it gets rendered, and then the user interacts, and then you have this loop. Okay, make sense? All right. So first of all, let's look at the how do we get started with Redux? First, let's how we install it. So to install it, here we have just a couple of steps of creating a brand new out of the box React application. So we called it hello Redux. So you know how that works already. And if you go in there, you can do cd hello Redux, and you can run it just saying by npm install, npm run. Yes, and that starts up your out of the box boilerplate React application, right? So nothing new there. What's new here is that we're going to install a couple of libraries, right? We're going to install first the Redux library. This Redux library is the core functionality of their Redux library. Okay, it's the same library across all frameworks, right? So whether it's Redux, whether it's React, whether it's Angular, whether it's whatever, you'll still need this core functionality of the Redux library. This one over here, the second one, that's called the React Redux library. This one is the glue, the one that glues together the React world with the Redux world, right? That does the plumbing, and that's where most folks get stuck, right? On the plumbing side. So stick with me; it'll be painful, right? The class will be painful. There it is. But we'll start with some really trivial examples, and we're just gonna go at it incrementally more complex, and just to ease our way into understanding what Redux is, right? So hopefully, what we'll do is that we'll repeat it until you see a pattern and it says, okay, I get the pattern, right? Once you get the pattern, then it'll be trivial going forward. Make sense?